Al put his life, first part of his life, on this tape, and he wanted me today to start mine, and so I'm going to start putting mine on there. My name is Belle Newman, and I was born February the 8th of 1921 to Frank Yeoman. His name was Lee Franklin, but all my life Daddy would just call Frank. And my mother's name was Carrie Louisa Nichols Pearl, if you can believe that. I was born in South San Antonio. Daddy worked for the railroad company. He was 28 years old. Mama was a housewife, and she was 25 years old. They had 4 girls and 2 boys. I was the 4th child. There was Inez, and then Lucille, then Frank Jr., and then me. Then when I was 6 years old, Leroy was born. And then 8 years later, Martha was born. I think I was supposed to have been the last one, really. Inez was always called Nuki, and Lucille we just called Sil. And Frank Jr. has always been called Sonny Boy, and we still call him Sonny Boy. Daddy always called me Skeeter. And as I was growing up, the kids that I run around with and all, everybody always called me Ann. But then later, when I started going with Al, he always called me Belle. And of course, his folks called me Belle, so the name just stuck. Daddy was born February the 24th of 1893, and he died January the 31st of 1957. He was 64 years old. And Mama was born December the 18th of 1896 and died November the 22nd of 1946. She was 50 years old. Mom and Daddy met in Beeville, Texas, and met in 11, and they were married for 35 years. They are both buried at Beeville, Texas. Then Lucille died August of 1985, and then Leroy died in July of 1988, and both of them are buried at Beeville, Texas. I forgot to say a while ago that when Mom and Daddy met and married, Mama was 15 and Daddy was just 19. I don't know when we moved from South San Antonio, but Mom and Daddy moved back to Beeville. They had lived in Beeville after they married, and their first 3 kids was born there. And they lived there until I was about 5 years old. I can't remember very much about that first 5 years, but in 1926 we moved to Kerrville. And when we moved there, Daddy had a dairy. They bottled the milk and delivered it around town. That's when Node came to live with us. That's Nuki's husband. And Nuki was just 16 years old. And she said then that that's the man I'm going to marry. And she did. She was 20 years old, but she married him. He worked for Daddy. And Nuki never went with anyone else. When we lived in Kerrville, that's where I started school. And you had to be 7 years old to start. And then we moved back to San Antonio, and Daddy worked for Buttercrust Bakery. I remember one time when times was hard. I'm going to give you you kids some of these bad old times. Our school class went on a picnic, and it was Easter, and I was supposed to bring Easter eggs. But we didn't have any eggs, and we didn't have any money to buy any. But Daddy brought home donuts to us all the time from the bakery, so I went on the picnic to the Easter hunt, and I took donuts. And gosh, the kids were glad to trade me eggs for donuts. so it turned out okay. When I was about 11 years old, we moved back to Kerrville, and that's when we lived in town while Daddy worked out on the Real Ranch. He was a game warden. But Mama and us kids had to stay in town so that me and Sonny Boy could go to school. Then on the weekends where we'd go out on the ranch and Daddy would cook either deer meat or turkey, and sometimes he'd cook both because he was a game warden, you know. And he'd cook apricots, and I'll tell you, those are the best apricots I ever tasted. He'd cook them real slow on the top of an old wood stove, cook stove, and it was really good. And he made cornbread, and he had an old Dutch oven, and he'd make the cornbread out in the yard in this Dutch oven. And I'll tell you, I'll never forget those times, and that food tasted so good. Of course, one of the reasons that the food tasted so good, because we didn't have much money to buy food in town. Mama had to pay rent and send me and son to school. And like I say, that was the bad old days. You kids don't know anything about days like that, and I hope you never have to. Then when Daddy started working for Real, we all moved out to the ranch. And that was where Martha was born. Nuki got married when we were living out there, and her daughter, Joyce, was born 1 month before Mama had Martha. So the grandchild was born first. That was in 1934. Then in 1936, we moved back to Beeville, and Mom and Daddy lived out the rest of their life in Beeville. And when we moved back there, I was 15 years old. That's when Al and I met. I was 15, he's 21. I'll never forget the first time I saw Al. He was walking down the railroad track in the front of our house, and he was going to where he was living at that time. He was walking like, boy, he thought he was hot stuff. Of course, I thought he was too. But before I start saying anything about Al and our lives together, I'll tell you some of the things that I know about my grandparents. Now, Daddy's father came to America when he was 20 years old. He came from Basford, England. He was born in Ruddington, England, on July the 20th of 1866. He arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1886. And then he met Florence Gertrude Sansom one day in church. And they tell the story about Grandma. She said, when she saw Grandpa, said, he's mine if I never get him. But she did get him, and they were married in 1890. And they lived happily together for 53 years. But when they died 14 days apart, and that was in 1942. They buried Grandpa the day that Pat was born. They lived all their married life in Beeville, Texas, and they had 10 children. They're buried at Beeville, Texas. They had 6 boys and 4 girls. They had Thomas, was Uncle Tom, and Daddy was named Frank, and then Charlie, and Charlie had a twin named Delbert. But Delbert died when he was 11 years old. And then Uncle Harry, and Aunt Ada, Aunt Anna Lee, and Albert. And then Grandma had Alma, and she was born after Albert. She was born, and then she died when she was just a baby. Then Aunt Edith. And now, in 1993, Aunt Anna Lee and Aunt Edith are still living. But in 1991, Aunt Ada was still living, and so was Uncle Albert. So that was 4 of that family still living. I don't know anything about Grandma Yeoman's family. I was too young to know anything about her family. And I really don't know too much about my mother's family. I just know that her mother came to America from England when she was 5 years old. I don't know anything about Grandpa Nichols' family. Grandma died when I was about 5 years old. And after that, well, Grandpa just lived with his kids. And he lived with us several times. He lived with us when we lived at Kerrville, and then I remember he lived with us in San Antonio. When he died, he was living with one of his sons, Uncle Bill, and that was in about 1932. I was 11 years old. They had 5 boys and 5 girls. And their boys was Jim and Harry and Bill and John and Oscar. And the girls was Annie and Maddie and Lula and Louise and Kate. I knew all of these except Uncle John, but Uncle John got killed in a car wreck one night when I was just a baby. We never were around too many of our cousins on Mama's side of the family. We knew a few. But some of them I never did know at all. I knew most of Aunt Lula's kids real well, and I knew Aunt Kate's kids. And now I'll get back to our life together. Al and I met in October of 1936 in Beeville, Texas. I was 15 and Al was 21. Al and Irvin Webb was living at Aunt Ada's house. They were working on a road job south of Beeville. Now, Aunt Ada had told Mama that they drank a lot of beer, and I liked him. And so I had told, just seeing him pass the house, I decided that I liked him. And I told Mama that, but she told me that I'd better not ever ask him to come to our house, or she'd just ask him to leave. But one evening I was at Aunt Ada's and Al walked me home. He asked if he could come and take me to the picture show on Saturday, and I said sure. So he came, not knowing anything about that. He came in and won them over. Mama let me go to the show with him, but boy was I scared when he got there. And he would have been if he'd have known what he was getting into. When he walked me home that night, he said, "I would kiss you good night, but I have a cold." I thought he was pretty sure of himself. He told me that on that first date, that someday we were going to get married. I laughed long and loud, but the last laugh was on me. I was babysitting an old lady at that time. They lived right next to Grandma and Grandpa Yeoman. And one night Al came by to see me, but I couldn't leave. The old lady had already gone to bed, so we just sat on the front porch and visited. That was the only 2 dates that we had before Al moved to La Crosse, Texas, and started working on the dairy. He lived with Mamie and her husband. We wrote back and forth to each other all the next year. Now, Al dated one girl that year, but I dated 2 or 3 boys. I was just 16 and never dated anyone until then. Most of the time, we went with a group of kids that were brothers and sisters. By we, I mean Sonny Boy and I. When I went to Laurel Valley and stayed with Nuki and Node, and I went with a boy there named Bud Tenney. He wanted me to be his girl, but I told him that I loved Al, and he said, "Then why are you here with me?" That was a hard one to answer. I got a letter while I was there, and Al asked me to marry him. But at 16, I was just too young, so I said no. Not just no, but no, not now. He said for me to go home, and he quit his job on the dairy and went back to Beeville. And we dated one more year. The last part of 37 and the first part of 38, until we married in October. When Al first came back from Lacoste, he stayed with Joe and Mamie, his brother, and they run a dairy at Skidmore, Texas. And Al just worked out there with Joe and Emmett. Emmett also lived there. I met Al's mother at Skidmore. His daddy was already dead. When she moved back to San Antonio, where she met Mr. Miller, and later they married and moved to Fort Worth. She lived there for the rest of her life. Al lived with us part of that last year that we went together, and he worked on oil rigs for Johnny Johnson. He worked with Daddy and Sonny Boy and Uncle Albert, Node and Paul Romine, Lucille's husband. About before we married, Al started working at the Beeville Creamery, about 2 months, I think. He started out at $30 a month, and the second month he got a raise to $45 a month. That's when we got married. Got an apartment that cost $18 a month. We didn't have a car, not much of anything else, but we were happy as if we had good sense. I was 17 and Al was 23. He got Saturday and Sunday off for the wedding. That was all the honeymoon we had. Al worked 12 hours a day, sometimes longer, 7 days a week. So I didn't see him much. That's how we made it, I guess. But we've made it so far for 54 years. It got better later on. Sometimes he had Sunday off. He wore white overalls, and I had to wash them on a rub board and boiled them in a boiling pot. We lived in a house that Nuki and Node had rented, and it had 3 apartments in it. Ours just had a kitchen and a bedroom. Everyone used the same bathroom. Then we met the Partlows. They lived next door to us. We got to be real close friends. We bought our first car from them, a 1932 Chrysler Sport Coupe, $125. That's the car I learned to drive. When Al would get so sleepy, too sleepy to drive, I would drive, and that's how I learned, at night. Then we met the Chris. They were our friends forever. They had Sandra. She was about 1.5 years, Gay in Virginia. Then after 4 years of marriage, we had Pat. We had waited so long, I had just about give up. She was born December the 8th of 1942, one pretty little girl. We were so proud of her. The war had started the year before, December the 7th of 1941. Al got a 3-month deferment so he could be home when the baby came. His call came November the 23rd of 1942. When he left February of 1942, he didn't want to leave us. Pat was 6 weeks old. I didn't want him to go either. He could have gotten out of going, but he believed it was his job and to go, so he did. It wasn't easy to stay home and raise a baby, and that was my job. The next time we saw Al, Pat was 6 months old. That was my first trip to Amarillo. The second trip to Amarillo, Pat was about 9 months old. That's when we met the Partlows, Pete and Dot. It wasn't easy to make a trip on a bus in those days. Sometimes I had to stand up and hold Pat in my arms because the bus was so crowded. Al started out making $30 a month for the Army, and then I got some money. I just don't remember how much, but each time Al got a stripe, he got more money, and so did I. I stayed at a hotel when I first got to Amarillo the second time. Dot Paget was staying there too. Later, we moved to a motel and shared 2 rooms. A bath with the Paget's kitchen was in our room, and the bath was in theirs. when you live with somebody like we did then, you get to knowing them real well. Our friendship has lasted all through these years. I went home and Al got to make a trip home, the first time since he left. Pat was 11 months old. She walked for Al the first time. Al went from Amarillo to Salt Lake City and then to Alexandria, Louisiana. I went to stay with Al there. Pat was 14 months old. They were getting ready to go overseas. Sure was hard to tell him goodbye because we didn't know if we would ever see him again. So then I went home and waited. The mail was sort of slow, and that was just about all we had to look forward to. Al went overseas and was stationed in England, and he flew 30 missions. But that is just another story. Pat was 3 years old when Al came home. But I had bought a house in Beeville while Al was overseas. When he returned home, we sold that house. Pat and I lived in that house by ourselves. She was not 3 years old yet. Then we moved to Corpus Christi and lived there for 5 years. We moved to Truby in August of 1951. Pat was 8 years old. We bought the house we live in now. Al, Joe, and Emmett and Joe's boys rebuilt the house. Al's mother died February the 8th, 1952. Joe and Emmett lived in Truby too. Joe had 3 boys and twin girls. Their first year we lived here, Al made $2,700. Compared with now, that's not much money, but we got by on it just fine. While we were doing the house over, I cooked in the yard, and Al made me a stove with bricks and a wire grill. We pulled the water up out of the well with a rope and a bucket. We had an outdoor toilet. It was rough. Pat started to school in Corpus. She was at a school where they had 4 rooms. She was in the 3rd grade when she started in Anson. Joe, Al's brother, and his wife Mamie, and their 5 kids lived at the old schoolhouse. Pat went to school with the twin girls at Truby. There was a big overhead bridge. One day when Pat was on her way home from the store across the bridge, a big truck was about to cross the bridge. She hurried on across, and after she got on this side, the bridge fell through with the truck. Quite a lot of excitement. The Donnellys lived across the road from us, and we got to be good friends, Adele and I, at this time. Adele and I are still friends after 42 years. The Fitzgeralds were friends of ours. They, at one time, had a store at Truby. They had 2 boys. Pat was friends with them. The oldest was Jerry. He was Pat's first boyfriend. Then he got killed in a car wreck. We used to visit, eat, and play dominoes with them a lot. But after Jerry got killed, the Fitzgeralds moved to Abilene, and we sort of lost contact with them. But Pat used to invite girls from school out here to spend the night. One time, 6 girls came out at one time. We had a lot of fun with them. Pat met Gail and started going with him when she was about 16. They married when she was 20. The year that Pat married, our Wayne was born. That was a happy time in my life. Soon after we moved to Truby, Pat and I started going to the Truby Baptist Church, and when she was 9 years old, we were both baptized and have been going ever since. Of course, not to the same church. I have taught juniors and ladies class up until last year. When Wayne was 2 1/2, Pat had our first grandchild, Joe. 18 months later came Darren. Then 3 years later came Rhonda. We had a lot of fun with those kids. They have stayed out here with us a lot of times. Wayne got to grow up with them more like brothers and sisters than he was their uncle. We have had a lot of Christmases out here. I have always loved having all the kids here at one time. When Wayne was 18 years old, he married Jan Hamby, and 3 years later, they had our last grandchild, Jessica. At this time, she is 8 years old. She came and stayed with us some time, and we really do enjoy her a lot. Let's go back to when Wayne was little and growing up. He was a joy to have around. One of the things we used to do when Wayne was small was fix a lunch and start out on Saturday morning and find old houses and museums and find out all we could about them. From Weatherford to Colorado City, Wayne enjoyed it at the same time as much as we did. Even found some old jails that we went through. We took Wayne on a trip out west Texas, sort of by the Big Bend country. When Wayne was about 13, Katrina Bear moved across the road from us. That's when he decided he wanted to work. He would do just about anything anyone wanted done, so he worked for Katrina and Mr. Burrow, made money and put it in the bank and saved up enough to buy his first pickup.